Well, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome back to After's Heart Ministries. And I am Rabbi Q. And walking in your purpose always results in a divine restoration. We'll get into that and more as we jump back into Parasha Miketz. And welcome to Midrash Rabba 2.0. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's jump into the next question, please.
The next question is, what does the idiom nakedness mean?
That's the rabbi's nugget. Move to the next one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Why did Joseph put his brothers in prison for 3 days?
All right, let's jump into it. So, first of all, before I do anything else or say anything else, does anybody in the Zoom call or present company want to comment on that question?
Well, what do we know about 3 days? We know that Jonah was in the belly of the big fish for 3 days. We know that Yeshua was in the depths of the earth for 3 days. So what is the significance of 3 days? Would be the question.
This may appear to be a rabbi's nugget because of its intensity, but we are going to jump into this. So let's do something fun. Let's play Protestant Christians for a moment. Okay? Mm-hmm. So now it is time for us to celebrate the resurrection, which happens on which day?
Well, at Protestant Christian, it would happen on that Easter thing.
Sunrise Sunday, right? Sunrise Sunday morning, right? So let's see what we got here. If we've got sunrise Sunday morning, and I tell you what we'll do is we'll go ahead and pretend like the anthropological system of calculation of days that seems to be how Hebrews calculate days is actually legitimate. Okay. So Protestant theologians say we count a day no matter how much little bit of time is present. So the fact that the sun cracked over the horizon and that started a day, and then Yeshua rose counts as one day. Okay. So here we go. One day, right? Then we go backwards into a night. So we'll go one day, one night. Okay. Then we'll count Saturday as a day, and we'll count Friday night as a night, and we'll count Friday as a day. How long was Jonah in the belly of the whale?
3 days.
3 days. Okay. So Jonah's in the belly of the whale for 3 days, right? What happens next? The next thing that happens is nights. How many nights was he in the belly of the whale?
I don't think we know.
3 nights. And so here's the important part. Yeshua says, no sign will be given. They said, by what authority do you do these things? Give us a sign. And he says, no sign shall be given except the sign of Jonah. For 3 days and 3 nights shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth, and on the 3rd day he shall rise again. So what's missing from our little Protestant Christian package that we have placed Yeshua in?
The 3rd night.
A whole night, right?
Well,
okay.
It actually is a whole lot more than that when we step into Hebrew understanding.
So let's start there and say that we probably need to reconcile something to put him in the proper position that he needs to be for a resurrection, because this particular parasha, remember, is called from the end, right? From the end is the name of this parasha. We always begin with the end in mind. Now, the beauty of our Bible study that we are doing is we get to look in hindsight. We know what happens to Joseph. When we drop Joseph into the pit and they decide to stage his murder, we already know that he is going to be restored. We already know that his son Ephraim is going to be the biggest tribe of all Israel and therefore receive the greatest inheritance of all Israel. We already know that he's going to be reunited with his father. We already know that he's going to get to meet his brother again. We already know what's going to happen with Judah and Reuben and Simeon. But what we don't know is how that actually felt, what actually was going on, because the moment you drop into that presence of empathy, you drop into, and this is important, you drop into the power behind the story. You see, in this particular parasha, we find Joseph throwing his brothers in prison for 3 days. Why? What significance does that have? Now, Deborah already did the remez. She already used the thematic connection, the theme of 3 days, to connect all of the 3-day periods she could think of. It's actually a few more, but that's okay. One of them is at Mount Sinai on the third day. Go ahead.
Something else. When Yeshua said to the Pharisee, the Pharisee said, "Show me a sign that you have permission to do this," when he was taking all the stuff out of the temple with the whip.
That's when he did the sign of Jonah.
And he said, in 3 days, this temple will be raised up on the 4th day.
On the third day.
On the third day. On the third day, sorry. So there's another one.
Okay.
That I think is very significant.
It is, isn't it? It is, isn't it? Because two things he says. He says, it is written, I am consumed with zeal for my father's house, but you have made it, and my father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. We understand the thematic significant enough to be able to connect the context of this same principle of preparation, right? So what is one of the definite truths present in this process? He starts as a shepherd with his father, exceeds his brothers in that process, moves into a state of overseership, and then is sent to Egypt. Jumps into the same principle with Potiphar's house. In the third instance, or the third installment of this same experience, he actually becomes king of Egypt. Now, a couple things that are really important here. First one is there's preparation. Something is preparing the next thing for the next thing. Had Jonah not ended up in the whale, Yeshua would not have the sign of Jonah. Why 3 days and 3 nights in the whale? Well, we know that it actually says that he was in Sheol, which means that he was dead, and that the whale belched him up onto the seashore, and he awoke from the dead. Had it not said that he was in Sheol, which is the grave, then we would have a very different thing. In fact, Christians interpret that word Sheol as hell, right? But my point being is that Jonah is in a state of death until that moment. So there's a couple ways we could go about this. Number one is maybe, just maybe, there was something appointed for his brothers that was way worse. And Joseph created a tikkun by putting his brothers in prison for the amount of time that he spent in the cistern. I suppose that's part of it. But what's significant is after this, Judah steps into a very different state than what he began. Okay? Because in the part where Joseph has his brothers in the court with him and they're eating, and then he puts them in prison, and then he pulls them out of prison and says, you are spies. But he did say something interesting. He says, I fear God, right? But he says, if you come before my face again, you will bring your brother to prove that you're not spies, right? And then he hears them arguing, right? But what does it say? It says what Joseph didn't, or what they didn't know, is that Joseph could interpret the language, right? And so they're speaking freely in Hebrew, right? And what happens? Reuben says, I told you. Who's he speaking to? Simeon. I told you that we shouldn't have done this to him. We're paying for it. Because why? Hebrews live within the law of reciprocation, right? And so now here's Joseph about to throw his brothers, or he's thrown his brothers in prison for 3 days. And what happens? Reuben says, see, now here's the crazy part. What y'all don't know is what I'm about to show you, which is very powerful, but is relevant here. Okay. And this is the part that if you don't study the Hebrew, you're going to miss. You're going to love this. But before we get into that, it's important for you to know that before or after he pulls them out of prison and they say those words, he did not know who the ringleader was. What do we know? Reuben is the one who tries to deliver Joseph when they end up wanting to kill him. Who wanted to kill him? Simeon, right? So now we have Reuben trying to deliver Joseph, but the problem is that Reuben's solution is to take the coward's way and sell Joseph, right? And then Judah plays a role here, but we're not going to get into that yet. But what I really, really want to show you is how this thing led to this thing, led to this thing, is all significant. 3 days and 3 nights before Yahweh presents himself at Mount Sinai, after children of Israel arrive at Mount Sinai, and Moses ascends, descends, ascends, descends, ascends, descends 3 times in one day. And the result is a covenant promise is made. A statement is made. You shall be a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a peculiar people. Which, of course, we know in After His Heart Ministries is the true gospel, because that's the only thing that was promised to both the people at Mount Sinai and to those who have entered into covenant with Yahweh through the renewed covenant, or the Brit Chadashah, through Yeshua, who sealed with his blood the new covenant. Luke chapter 20, verse 22, I believe it is. Okay, now, it might be 22:20. So, in that context, let's jump into the sweet little nugget that we have here in this particular part. And actually, this might even answer the next question as I look at it here. I see you skipped that one. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and share our screen. All right. So now we are going to jump over to this section where he throws them in prison. Which I believe is in chapter 42. Yeah. Okay, this is where it says, they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. For that reason, this distress has happened upon us. And Reuben answers him saying, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Now justice for his blood is required. They did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. And then he turned away from them and wept. But when he returned to them and spoke, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. So we know that Simeon was kind of the ringleader in this. Okay, so but what I want to show you is actually right here, where it says, so he put them all together in prison for 3 days. We will go here. And very specifically, we are going to go to this word prison, right? So this prison is mishmor, okay? Or I'm sorry, mishmar. And mishmar is a place of confinement or prison or jail or watch or observance, coming from the root word shamar, which means to guard or protect or observe, right? Okay, now watch this. When we go to the word prison in chapter, I believe it is in, nope, it is not in 37. I apologize. Is it in 30? I thought it was in 30. Okay. Oh yeah, okay. So here he is in charge of Potiphar's house, right? And then it says that he got in trouble with the wife, and then he's imprisoned, and his master took him and put him into the prison. Okay. In the Hebrew, it is Sohar. Okay. Sohar. All right. So what we know here is that Sohar is a very different word from Mishar. Okay. So that's important. We're talking about two different kinds of prisons here, right? House of Roundness, or the roundhouse prison, right? Sohar. And then let's take a look at something else. So let's jump over to Genesis 36, I believe it is. No, that's not it. Genesis 37. And what we're going to look for is this word right here. Threw him into the pit. Okay. So when we look at this word pit, we have this word bur, right? Pit, well, or cistern. And bur in the sense of a hole that has been bored into the earth, right? But what I would like you to see is this here. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon, which is where he was located in prison. And look at what word is used for the word dungeon here. Boor. So let's talk a minute about this. In the Hebrew, when Joseph gets in trouble with Potiphar's wife, he's thrown into the boor. When he is in trouble with his brothers, he's thrown into the boor. Do you know what the Hebrew word for, or I'm sorry, do you know what Yeshua was thrown into in the Hebrew, not in the Greek? He was thrown into a cistern in the Greek. But that particular word is actually the Greek word that is used to describe the boor. Yeshua ends up in a boor, just like Joseph. Okay. Now, a couple of things that are important about this, and the key to this is to understand that Joseph is thrown into a boor, but his brothers are thrown into a mishmar. Okay. And furthermore, Joseph is put in charge of a sohar. Okay. So those are three different kinds of what we would call prisons. Now, what's interesting is, what does it actually say in the Hebrew about what Joseph did with his brothers? They were put in a mishmar. What's a mishmar? A mishmar is a place of watch, a place of guarding. So in a short version of this, they were put under guard, which means they were probably on house arrest. They did not experience prison, as it were. Okay. The word prison is put there in the English, but in the Hebrew, it is very different from the boor, which is a hole bored in the earth, drilled into the earth. When when Joseph speaks to the men who he interprets a dream for, he says, I'm here innocently. I am not supposed to be in the boor, right? So Joseph equated his sohar as a boor. I propose to you that the significance here is that he never subjects them to the boor, which shows something very powerful about this. Number one, the house arrest is a mercy, which means it most likely was a tikkun. It satisfied whatever was written against them that they should receive. In other words, Joseph was in an operation as a master of mysticism, a master of understanding how to fix circumstances, right? Okay. Why is this important? Is it about the fact that he's benevolent and shows mercy to his brothers? Is it about the fact that he actually just wanted a relationship with them? I mean, those are the sermons we hear. We hear Joseph just wanted to be one of the guys. Joseph just wanted to do this, but his pride kept him away from it. Oh my gosh, the sermons I've heard on Joseph. I've studied Joseph out so thoroughly that I can tell you every little teeny tiny nuance of the story. And even today, I notice that extra thing about the cows. But the premise is important here. He did not throw his brothers in prison. He put them under guard for 3 days. So when we look at this, what we see is, number one, that whatever happens with this 3 days, 3 nights situation all across Scripture, Joseph has demonstrated mercy. Now, I'm going to propose that when you really study out Yahweh, study out the name, study out the consciousness, because we're not dealing with personality here. Personality is a development as a result of a temperament and an environmental influence. Yahweh's not influenced by environments. Yahweh's not influenced by human behavior, period, which totally dismisses dispensationalism. But I can tell you that Yahweh declares himself on a regular basis as merciful. In fact, even Quran mentions that he is most merciful. Now, the only reason I say this is because no matter what Abrahamic religion we get into, Yahweh is merciful first. Now, we could get into the mysticism of the Sifirot and say the first true perceivable Sifirot is chesed, or is the mercy of God. But let's stick a little bit with Torah and say, when Moses is in the cleft of the rock, Yahweh walks by and declares himself and says, Yahweh, Yahweh, Rahum. In other words, he attaches Rahum, or compassion, to his name first. And I propose to you that when Torah lists a list of things, the most important one is the first one. Not the greatest one, but the most important. The greatest one will always be last, but the most important one will be first. So the significance of the greatest one is that it will provide the most abundance for equal distribution of whatever it is. Whereas the most important one is the one that we need to pay the most attention to. Thoughts?
Well, my thought was that Yeshua is the word. He is the Torah, right? And that in order to show the comparison, show that he is the word of God, he also would have to be under guard.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what we saw happen in the Brit Hadashah, that his tomb, in quotes, air quotes here, that his tomb was placed under guard for those days so that no robbers would come and steal his body or whatever to be claimed. So yeah, I was like, okay, well, that completely makes sense, that we would see that all of his life would be merciful, right? As a mercy to us. And that we would see the guarding as well for 3 days.
Okay. So the next part, or the next part of this will be what happens to Judah, but we'll get into that in a minute. What I really want to bring forward here is that Joseph was not merciful for ego's sake. Let me explain. The rabbis, and I don't know if this is Midrash Rabba. I actually don't know where this is at. Trying to think if it is in maybe the Talmud in Shabbat. Oh, I can't remember, but the rabbis asked the question: did Joseph show mercy to his brothers, or was his foot on their necks? And what I mean by that is, what was his intention, right? And they explained that he was in an extreme state of piousness, that his suffering had driven him into a state of piety, and that his denial of self, which was basically a forced denial of self, was actually an effective alteration of his piety. So when he is benevolent to his brothers here, he is actually operating in the highest self that he could operate in. And the reason that's important is because there was a motivation behind putting them together and locking them up and listening to what they say. That's a very real thing. In fact, I believe that the word here for interpreter means listener, but let me look here. I'm not going to share this one this time. I'm just going to look real quick. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, interestingly, it's not interpreter. It's a scorner or a rumor teller. So yeah, it is. It is a listener. It's somebody who basically is in a state kind of mockery and was probably kind of like maybe a planted spy or whatever. Okay, so anyways, that is the importance of the fact that his brothers were put in prison for 3 days. It's not prison. It's totally connected to what happened to Joseph himself, but also it's connected to Jonah and Yeshua through the 3 days and 3 nights. And of course, Yeshua also ending up in a cistern instead of under guard. Yes, he's placed under guard after he's dead, but when he's in prison, the Greek word is cistern. Okay. All right. We'll take a brief break here and then we'll jump into the next question. All right. Well, we are back. So we're going to jump into the next question, and depending on which one you ask, because I'll either address it or I'll move to the next one.
It says, why was eating with the Hebrews loathsome to the Egyptians?
Mhm. Okay. So repeat that one more time.
Why was eating with the Hebrews loathsome to the Egyptians?
Okay. So we actually need to get into the we probably need to get into some things here for sure. This of course is in chapter 43, I believe, when he eats with them. There it is, right there, in verse 32. But let me go ahead and share my screen here first. Okay. And this is what it says. It says he washed his face and came out, and he controlled himself and said, serve the meal. Then they served him by himself and Joseph's brothers by themselves. And the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to Egyptians. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into this question a little bit. Any thoughts?
Well, I know that they considered shepherds or persons that held cattle to be of much lower class. They wouldn't have associated with them.
Okay. Isn't it kind of a strange thing, though? I mean, we could get into all kinds of ancient, qualms that nations had about each other, but we're talking about Torah here, right? So share with me, anybody want to share with me about what they think would be the reason why they would find shepherds abominable and very specifically refuse to eat bread with Hebrews? Anybody?
Okay, because to me, this is bringing up a very weird question. I mean, at how many Hebrews were there at this point? And why would have Egyptians made such a claim to such a small portion of what was at that point the known world?
Okay. Any other question or any other insights or questions into that context? Anybody?
But I'm going to go further. When we look into what is our past, but the future from the point we're at right now, it begs the question. I wonder why the Pharisees at that point had regulations about eating with other nations in general. I wonder if they had just gotten to the point where they had seen how Egypt had treated Jacob and his family, and the the sons of Jacob at that point, and not eaten with them and carried that through.
Okay.
I have thoughts.
Okay, go ahead, Joshua.
So we see that Joseph is separate, right, by himself, and then you've got the brothers over there, and then you get the Egyptians by themselves. So
Okay.
like part of it I see is like even though Joseph is in charge, they still have him separate, from the rest of them and everything. And you could say, okay, this is because he's second in command or whatever, but I wonder if he intentionally kept himself separate, because he's showing like he's not in their system, right? He's not, a part of this and everything. And you could, I think, go as far to say that they were in exile, right? Joseph was in exile. The brothers are in exile, or the beginning of exile. And so they're not a part of, that system, and they're keeping themselves apart from that system. And I can see, to Deb's point, where the Pharisees might have brought that back from exile in Babylon, misunderstanding that they were not to be that to the nations, right? Once they're in the land and foreigners are coming into the land, they should have been, teaching them and elevating them. But let's go back to where we are now. And then specifically why the Egyptians might have seen it as an abomination. I find that word very interesting. Is that their main god was a ram.
Mm-hmm.
So they see these people that shepherd and eat rams as detestable,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
which goes further, but we're not there right now, of Israel leaving Egypt, slaughtering a bunch of rams.
Right? Yeah, I think it has to do with the fact that their religion. I mean, in Hebrew understanding, the pig is abominable. We don't touch it. We don't eat it. If we do, it's unclean for us. So in their religion, the things that the Hebrews are practicing, they couldn't interact with.
Okay. So first, and this is important, when we look at this, yes, Yehoshua, thank you very much for showing that context, that they had a religious element to this, right? Because one of the mistakes that we make in this is to assume that the Egyptians were religious in the sense of devoutness. The Egyptians were religious in the sense of the logical processes. And what I mean by that is it wasn't about devotion to their God that made it abominable, but that it was illogical to consume these meats and govern these animals that are supposed to be free. Yet something interesting happens in this, and I think that's an important point to bring forward, is that when in the next parasha, we're going to see that when Jacob is asked his profession by Pharaoh, Pharaoh, instead of rejecting that system, says, you can go live in the land of Goshen, and I will put you in charge of my flocks. Which is intriguing because, again, when you have an animal representing a god, that animal is allowed to roam free. I mean, a good example of this, you can look in India, in Hinduism, to the cow, right? Not only do they not eat, but they do not govern the cow. And it's interesting how all that works out. And obviously I'm speaking very simply here, right? I'm not looking at the depth of the nuances of a pantheon of a particular civilization. But the premise is that the abomination seems to go a little bit deeper. And I'm going to logically propose that some of this has to do with Abraham. I'm going to show you, okay? So first and foremost, and I think this is really, really important, is that we try to go ahead and look at the concept or the word Hebrew itself, okay, which we'll do here in a moment. Let me go ahead and pull it up so that we can just jump straight into it, because I think that is going to be a relevant element here. Just give me a second to get it pulled up. There we go. And all right, so we are looking at Genesis chapter verse 39 is actually where I want to go. Verse 39. Or I'm sorry, chapter 39. And of course, we know this parasha starts in 41, verse 1. And so we're in chapter 39, we're working with Potiphar's wife. And we'll get to the point that I'm going to get at here. Okay. That's not sharing correctly. I'm frozen. So this is kind of interesting here. This is I get kicked out of my own room. Good job, Zoom. How much do we pay again for this? All right. So we're going to ignore that for now, not let it disturb our Shabbat. So the point that I was making before I got kicked out of my own room is that we need to look at something when it comes to Potiphar's wife, okay? And I think that is extremely important here, that we see this, okay? So in Genesis chapter 39, this is actually what we've got going on. When we encounter the wife, right? And the incident happens where she grabs his coat and he runs away. We encounter this word right here. We encounter the word Hebrew, right? So let's go ahead and jump into this. she identifies him as a Hebrew. Okay. So what we need to ask is this significant that she calls him a Hebrew? And can we identify anything that would indicate that that is part of the relevance here? Now, if we go into the usages, chapter 40 is the next reference to the word Hebrew, because it says, I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. So what do we know? We know that Egypt is not the land of the Hebrews. But interestingly enough, Joseph was kidnapped from Canaan, right? Okay, look at verse 41. Now a Hebrew youth was there with us, servant of the captain of the bodyguard. Over and over, we see this identification of Hebrews, right? All right, well, let's go to the first instance right here. Genesis chapter 14, verse 13. And I think we might have a little bit of our answer, because the first usage of the word Hebrew is identified with Avram. And I can tell you, it does not appear before now. Okay? This is the first usage of the word. Sorry, got a little bit ahead of myself there. There we go. This is the first usage. It's the first time the word Ivri is present. Ivri. Okay? And Ivri is from the root Ever. Okay? Which we only see as Eber, right? Now, I'm going to tell you what anthropologists say and what archaeologists say. They say that the Hebrews were simply, the reason they were called Hebrews is because they were the bloodline of Eber. Now, the reason Eber is so important to a historical something is because it was during Eber's lifetime that he ends up naming his children something. I'm going to show you that here in a moment. We're going to jump over to Eber, the first usage of Eber, and discuss what we have here. Okay, so first of all, let's jump over into Genesis chapter 10. Okay. In Genesis chapter 10, we have the two sons who were born to Eber. One is named Peleg, which is division, for the earth was divided in his day, right? And his brother's name was Joktan. We can jump into that. It looks like blue letter is frozen up. Let's see if it has. No, it hasn't. Okay, so we'll go to Genesis chapter 10 and jump over to Eber. In verse 25, and we'll look at Joktan. Joktan actually is smallness or katan, okay? And so the relevance is that he names his son division in the sense of the fact that the earth was divided. Now, this somewhat gets into deluge apologetics, which is important. Deluge apologetics basically says that the flood is our greatest proof of our creator, and the flood is our greatest proof of creation itself being intelligent design. Okay. But one of the more important aspects of the flood is timing. Okay. When we look at the flood, we understand that after the flood. In Genesis chapter 10 is when we get this discussion about the earth being divided up. Now, we've got answers in Genesis. We've got Radio Bible class, I believe, RBC Ministries doing the Back to Genesis section of their devotional. Institute for Creation Research, I believe, does the Back to the Genesis, not the RBC. Somehow they are linked together. I can't remember how. But anyways, point being is these creationists say, well, here's proof of how long ago it was. And then they go through and they kind of prove that there's kind of a 5,000 year gap between the newest soil that exists at the East Atlantic Ridge and the soil that is on the beach of New York. Now, the reason that's important is because Brighton Beach in New York contains seashells that have the same DNA as seashells that are on the west coast of Africa at the bottom of the tip, where the two tectonic plates fit together. So Eber names his son after what's happening on the earth at that time, which is a movement of the plates and therefore a breaking up. And all of a sudden, what would be one land is starting to become more than one land. And he names his son Peleg, which means division. Now, the reason why this is so important is because people logically deduce that anybody who was involved with Eber was the first to prophetically name a son after the flood. Who was the first to name somebody before the flood was Enoch. Enoch named his son Methuselah, which means his death shall bring, which meant as soon as he dies, my prophecies will come to pass. And here's the proof, right? Well, Eber names his son division because the earth was divided in those days. You need to understand his son was born, his name was Peleg, then the earth was divided. So people have deduced that anybody who was a Hebrew was actually of the bloodline of Eber, which means they were bloodline of prophets, right? However, I'm going to propose to you that there's another element to being Hebrew. And I'm going to propose to you that when Abraham is called a Hebrew, that it is not just because he's a son of Eber, but instead that the word Hebrew has nothing to do with him being an Eberite. But instead, a Hebrew is actually someone who has crossed over. And I will propose to you that we need the whole story of Abraham to understand what a Hebrew is. We need to look back to his days in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. We need to look to the covenants that were made with him. We need to look at all the things because, truth be told, it's not until Genesis 14 that the word Eber is used, or Ivri is used. But Abraham was different, and he declared himself different. And I propose to you that Hebrews maintain an identity that is different from the cultures around him. The ancient Hebrew nomad was removed from the dominant culture of his time. Abraham demonstrates, and this is important, Abraham demonstrates that he is not going to be a city dweller, that he is actually going to be contrary to what was the land of Canaan, which was a bunch of city-states. And that the only ones who actually dwelt outside the cities were thieves, and very specifically marauders who would raid supply convoys. Meaning what? Meaning that Abraham was living differently than everyone else. And I propose to you that That's why he was known as a Hebrew, because he had crossed into something very different from the rest of his culture. He was removed from the dominant culture of his time. Now, we could get into some crazy stuff here if we looked at the pictographic Hebrew of the word avar, which means to pass over. But I can tell you this much, that what you think you understand about Hebrews has nothing to do with Judaism. And I propose to you that Yeshua was a Hebrew, not a Jew. And I will propose to you that Paul was a Hebrew, not a Jew. And I propose to you that Peter was a Hebrew, not a Jew, and that it has nothing to do with blood. And as we're about to see next week, the passport to being a Hebrew is adoption. So I propose that one of the reasons eating with the Hebrew is loathsome is because of what happened with Abraham and Pharaoh. It would have been documented. It would have been some sort of papyrus scroll saying, if you ever encounter this dude or his bloodline, don't mess with them. They're liars. They're and they bring plagues with them. Right?
Right. Right. That makes more sense to me, and the fact that when Abram and Sarah go down to Egypt and that whole scenario happens and there's a plague on Pharaoh's house because he took Sarah, that makes sense to me that all Hebrews would have then gotten a bad name because the Pharaoh of that time would have said, hey, these people, don't play with them, don't mess with them, don't eat with them, don't associate with them,
because they bring curses.
they can bring a curse.
How much of that is actually a mercy? Romans chapter 9 says that who God decides to bless and who God decides to curse is up to him, right? And what is proposed in Romans 9 is that Pharaoh was raised up for that purpose. But I want you guys to really register something. Hebrews, and this is important, are not, let me repeat that. Hebrews are not, one more time, Hebrews are not Augustinian. Hebrews do not follow the philosophy of Martin Luther, and Hebrews do not follow the philosophy of Calvin. Nor do they follow the philosophy of the rabbis. Yeshua had his own philosophy. He had his own outlook on life, his own worldview. It was so contrary that the people, when they walked away from the Sermon on the Mount, say, this guy does not teach like our teachers. He teaches like one of authority, thus declaring that their teachers don't have authority over them, but he does, and also declaring that they don't have any idea who he is. And his ways were so different that they identified that he was not like the teachers of their time. We see that throughout. Look at Isaiah. Look at Elijah and his lifestyle choices. They are reflective of Abraham. And I propose to you that After His Heart Ministries at large is a corporation of Hebrews. And in principle, that corporate body is actually Abrahamic in nature more than any other Abrahamic faith that exists, because what we have chosen to do is align ourselves with the lifestyle of the father of all who believe, circumcised or uncircumcised, Abraham. His choices, his way in which he dealt with humans, his way in which he withdrew, which he aligned, who he entered into covenant with, who he did not enter into covenant with, who he honored, who he did not honor, who honored him and who did not honor him, who he fought and who he did not fight. You see, those are keys to being a Hebrew. And I propose to you that the only way that you can be a Hebrew is to be a son of Abraham. I propose to you that that's why Paul says not all Israel is Israel, but only the sons of the promise, and then brings up the promise of Isaac, as if to say, through Abraham's seed are you a Hebrew, which is a son of God, which is a whole nother level that we don't necessarily need to get into today. But I propose to you that it's the difference between crossing from, what's the crossing over? From a son of Adam to a son of God. He who rules the earth, or Malkut, and he who rules the heavens, or the higher worlds. And I propose to you that that's not necessarily the higher worlds that are inaccessible to us, but instead the higher self, or the higher vision of who we really are. I propose to you that Hebrews hold the torch of divinity within the context. So let's look back at our metaphor, as it were, that began today's parasha study. And that is what? That there is a past, which was what? The cattle who were skinny and were not, the ones that were not in good shape, being attracted by the cattle who were on the edge of the shore, or if we accept that they weren't on the edge of the shore, being attracted to the scarcity instead of to the abundance, right? That's the key, which we determined could be guilt. But we also determined that Mitzrayim are the ones who attracted the famine, just like Canaanites attracted the famine, because they were trying to control their gods by sacrificing humans, drinking blood, torturing animals, etc., right? The premise, and this is important, is that Mitzrayim is in the dual plural and means two limitations, which we've determined is fear and doubt, right? But now I'm going to add one more element to this. And I'm going to say that it is an abomination for a mind that is in a state of limiting beliefs to comprehend the wisdom of a mind that is in a state of crossed over. What does that mean? That means that it is illogical, unexplainable, and possibly foolishness to try to communicate the light of the upper worlds to a mind that is trapped in limitations. And I propose to you that that's the key to discipleship, and that's the key to everything. So why were the Hebrews an abomination? Because the light is a threat to the limiting beliefs, a threat to the limitations, a threat to Mitzrayim, a threat to Egypt. I propose to you that nothing else threatens Egypt except the Hebrews. But here's the crazy part about it. What people don't know is when the plagues fell upon Egypt, when Abraham was there and was a Hebrew, and if we allow that connection, that now the Egyptians don't allow themselves to eat with the Hebrews or honor them, and they can't live with them, then there is a mercy upon Egypt. If they would have left the Hebrews alone, Egypt would not have been wiped out by the plagues. And we know that whatever nation existed before the plagues didn't afterwards. And whatever nation rose up after the plagues in place were imposters. They rose up, the nation of Egypt, they went in and they squatted the cities. They squatted the land. And those became the pharaohs that we've dug up, not the pharaohs that we don't know. And of course, I've talked to you before about the timeline shift and the mistakes that have been made with anthropology and archaeology. But the system itself is present in the fact that Abraham brought plagues upon Egypt. The Egyptians took note of that and made it a practice to leave them alone. This Hebrew word abomination, I think, bears necessity to look at. It's to'eva, okay? To'eva. So let's go ahead and get into it. And then after that, we'll take another break. Okay, so jumping back over to our parasha. And looking at that word right there, to'eva, a disgusting thing or an abomination. Now, let's go look at first usage. First usage is actually 4332. This is the first usage of the word abomination. Let's take a look at some of the other places where this word is used. 1822, you shall not sleep with a male as one sleeps with a female. It's an abomination. How about Proverbs? I always like Proverbs because people like to use 1822 to treat people in a horrible way. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 6:16. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination, right? How about Proverbs 8:7? For my mouth will proclaim truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips. Okay? So we can see this word being used, but let's go study this puppy out because it's an important word. It comes from ta'av, which means to abhor or be abominable. Okay? Let's see if we can find some wisdom in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. Utilizing the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, putting in our Strong's Concordance number, and of course, we don't use the H because it's only Hebrew, ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, not Greek. And the new Strong's numbering system uses a G or an H to accompany the numbers. And here we are, to'eva, from a, so this is a adopted root, right? And if we look, the next one up, or the next word up is going to be tav mim, okay? Which means what? Which means that's as far as we get to go with this word. However, it's interesting, to'eva itself, or ta'av itself, contains the Hebrew letters tav, ayin, and beit in a very specific set. But I want to see this. I want you to see this right here. Something that is highly distasteful, that arouses marked aversion in one. Okay? In other words, it is more about caution than it is about prejudice. And I think that is extremely important here. And even though that this is defined as the word hate, okay, what it really identifies is that it's something that you need to be cautious of, which means that it can somehow result in harm that may be irreparable. Okay? So in that context, let's jump back over here to our verse and let's see if we can see this now. If we do have that same proof that we've been discussing, which is, if I was to read this way, then they served him by himself and Joseph's brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. Two things. Number one, for that is something to be cautioned against to the Egyptians, right? But then I want to really drop into this part right here. What is bread to a Hebrew? What was bread to a Hebrew? What do we know bread to be? Yeshua is with his brothers, with his disciples, right? And they say, hey, how come you don't eat? And he says, I have other bread to eat. And they say, what, did he go buy something when we weren't looking? And he says, no, it is to know and do the will of God. Which brings us back to purpose, which brings us back to value. Because if there's something that is very important about this parasha, it's that purpose will always result in restoration. When you are operating in your purpose, restoration will occur. When you are not, things will come close, but not to you. That which you lost will not be returned. In fact, it might even come this close and not be returned. That is very important here. And although, again, I use this term and it is not my term, but I use this term to kind of describe the situation, maybe a little bit more extreme than the context of the term. And maybe I need to come up with a better phraseology, but the system is simple. When you are operating in your purpose, you are divinely enabled. And in that divine enabling, there will be some sort of restoration. But when you deny your purpose and don't walk in it, then you will not receive that divine assistance. Any thoughts? Okay, so I actually want to just take a really brief break. We're going to jump into this last little question, which we need to get into, and then we will take a longer break, and then we will get into the rabbi's nugget. Okay. Let's just go ahead.
Last question.
Let's take a brief break, just a brief one.
Okay.
Real quick. Okay. All right, Shalom. So we are back, and we'll just jump into this last question, and then we'll take a longer break, and then we'll jump into the Rabbi's Nugget.
So the last question is, what is the significance of Judah's behavior in this parasha?
Mm. So there are two things that happen in this parasha that are significant. So the parasha goes until Genesis 44:18. And the last verse says, then Judah approached him, right? And so, okay, when we are looking at the parasha, a couple things that we need to understand, and that is that I'm sorry, Genesis 44:17. And that is that the first thing that is said in the next parasha is, and Judah approached. Okay. Now, I want to propose to you that there is significance to this context. And the biggest one is basically that there is contained in Judah something different than the rest of the brothers. Now, a couple things that are important. First one, Judah is the bloodline legitimate wife child, right? She's the Leah is the first wife, and she's the unloved wife, and Judah is the last of those births. Okay. Now, that then leaves Reuben, Levi, Simeon, and then Judah. So what do we know about Simeon? Well, Midrash, Rabba, I think probably Rashi, and possibly Rambam, which is Maimonides, all say that Simeon was the ringleader who wanted to kill Joseph. Reuben was the one who decided to trade Joseph, and Judah did nothing. But after Judah gets out of 3 days and 3 nights in prison, of course, we've established that it wasn't prison, he changes. And I'm going to show you how. Reuben turns around and fingers Simeon. Simeon is then arrested. Reuben turns around and says, I told you guys so, right? Simeon is arrested and is kept, and they send the brothers back, right? We won't encounter the rest of that story until next week, but what we will encounter, or what we do encounter in this one, is that Judah is about to change. And what I mean by that is he's going to take upon himself a willingness to be selfless, okay? And this is powerful because of what happens with Judah in general, right? So,
but even in 43, we see Judah also stand up and take responsibility for Benjamin, right? He swears to his father that the boy will return.
Right. Yeah. And so it's important. And I've been in a number of midrashes where we kind of study out the brothers. But what's important is what Judah offers. And I think that is very, very significant. Judah goes from being a non-participant in rescuing Joseph.
I think you got that backwards. Reuben is the non-participant. Judah sells him.
Oh, Judah sells him. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for correcting that. I appreciate that. So what we have is we have this switch occur where Judah goes from the one who removes Joseph from the equation in a very cowardly way. He comes up with a solution that works for everybody, right? But it is not right, and it is not the right thing. Or is it? And I'm gonna show you this next week. But the premise is, and this is important, that Judah says to his father, I will give my life for the boy, right? Now, the significance here is in what Christianity calls the substitutionary sacrifice, or what we would, and that's really inappropriate terminology, but what we would say is that someone would die for someone, okay? And that's raised in Romans chapter 5, right? So there's a couple things that we probably could get into here, but I think one of the most important ones is I'm just going to read this. I am not actually going to share the screen with you. I'm just going to read this to you. Romans chapter 5. Starting in verse 6, for while we were still helpless, at the right time, Yeshua HaMashiach died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous person, though perhaps for the good person someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Yeshua HaMashiach died for us. How much more than having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through him. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to Elohim through the death of his son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. I propose to you that Judah is now going through something that will later on be a mechanism by which everybody is brought into the family of God. Now, I will show you next week how Judah actually correctly did what he was supposed to do, even when he sold Joseph. But I'm going to propose to you that it was an evolution. In other words, Joseph even acknowledges that Judah's mechanism was not of his design. And that's going to be a hard thing to get through with this next parasha. But this is important. This part right here, this propitiation element that is actually the mechanism of Yeshua's process, in that he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. That imputation element is contained here in these words that Judah is saying in chapter 43. What I mean by that is that Judah is demonstrating attribute of he's demonstrating an attribute of that process. Um, is that in 42 or 43? Yeah. So, yeah, you may put, Reuben says you can put my sons to death, right? But Judah, yeah, it is in 43. So Judah is the one that says, so Judah said to his father Israel, send the boy with me, and we will rise and go, that we may live and not die, as well as you and our little ones. I myself will take responsibility for him. You may demand him back from me. If I do not bring him back to you and present him to you, then you can let me take the blame forever. Right? Okay. So, and I think this is important that that's where we see a evolution in the Messiah process. So we go from design, and you guys remember that after his heart ministry's philosophy is that Yahweh adjusts his plan to be a mechanism of our authority here on earth as sons of Adam. The plan doesn't change, but the circumstances by which the plan is accomplished changes based on our choices, right? And so from that, then we can actually end up with a very different path than what began. But the plan is still present. The purpose is still present, etc. Right? So the system here is one of where we start out with Judah selling Joseph, which has its own ramifications we'll get into next week. But now we have Judah offering his life, right? He's offering himself as the substitution for what's present there. That's where we get that he made him who knew no sin. So what's the higher, right? Do we want to go with the idea of the Messiah ben Joseph as the one who is sold? Or do we want to identify that selling was necessary for us to be included in a covenant that was exclusive to a very specific group of people, was now made available through adoption, which of course we'll get into next week. And very specifically, an imputation occurs of a change in status and identity. Remember, this whole thing, Miketz, this whole parasha is about identity. Identities being maintained, identities changing, and identities being something that we didn't realize, right? And I think that is very important. And I propose to you that the significance is in the actual elements of the parasha itself. Miketz is a tikkun. And if you can learn the tikkun and understand it better, you can understand the mechanism, not only of the mercy of God. This is not a righteous nation. Pharaoh didn't respond to the plagues and say to God, would you destroy a righteous nation? But Abimelech did. And how is a person going to stand before God and state a standard as high as righteous without understanding what righteousness actually is, which is the equal distribution of the light, albeit sometimes through monetary trade or legal tender, right? Sometimes it is an equal distribution of gold, but sometimes it's an equal distribution of energy, an equal distribution of light. And that's the key. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the equal distributor of his light, right? Okay. which requires identity that is not merited, but is maintained through a mental strength that is not present in those who are in Mitzrayim, who are in limitations. And so now you see the power behind this truth and this context. Any thoughts? Anybody want to? And Yehoshua,
Yeah.
thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, like I'm actually, it's really weird. Like I'm fairly, the only word I could say is like bristling against that,
Okay.
because Judah is not doing, uh, he's not saying I'll go in his place. He's not saying that because he has to take Benjamin with him, right? He's taking responsibility, right? Reuben, right, in the earlier story says, you know, throw him in the pit, you know, and it says like because he's going to come back, or he's going to release him later, right? But then he disappears. Reuben disappears, right? And then in this one, he still doesn't take responsibility. He's like, you know, my kids, I'll give you my kids if this happens. And Israel, right? Because it's not Jacob here, it's Israel.
Right.
Is like, what the heck, right? But then Judah speaks up and says, like, I'll take responsibility. It'll be on my head. But that's not like, if Benjamin were killed or kept or anything, like, he hasn't taken the place of Benjamin.
So could we logically infer, though, that Judah is saying that you can put me to death if the boy is not returned?
So I don't think we can. And the reason why
Okay.
is because of how Israel responds to Reuben. When he says, you're going to take me down to my grave, why would he not have the same response to Judah? Right? Because he's operating in Israel now. He's not Jacob. Right?
Okay.
So he's seeing one of his boys, in my mind here, like, step up to the plate of responsibility. Like, truly. Which is why he agrees to it.
Mhm.
Right? Because if he just sees the same offer, that doesn't make any sense. If it just Reuben's sons or Judah, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you know, you guys are going to take me down to my grave, because he can still lose Benjamin and everything. So no, I have to say Israel is seeing this differently, and he's seeing Judah take this responsibility.
Yeah, I think it's significant that it says that Judah said to his father Israel, right? You would agree with me that is definitely a different entity than Jacob. And
Right, but we don't see Jacob in any of this, right? Reuben speaks to his father Israel too, right?
right.
Yeah.
And so both of them are appealing to an element of covenant, right? So send a boy with me and we will rise and go. Let's see. Let me see what it actually. Let's take a look at it. And if I find it to be significant enough, I'll share the screen. Judah saith unto Israel, his father, send the youth with me, and I will rise and go and live and do not die, both we and thou and our infants. I am a surety for him. From my hand thou dost require of him. If I have not brought him unto thee and set him before thee, then I have sinned against thee all the days. You know what's interesting here is, and I think you and I have actually discussed this a little bit, is he's actually offering exile here. He's offering that if he was to sin against Yeshua, that he would go into exile. I'm not Yeshua, Israel. if he sinned against Israel, like, then I have sinned against thee all the days. For if we have not lingered, surely now we had returned these 2 times. So in principle, he's offering to be exiled, which is intriguing because it's actually the house of Judah that goes into exile to preserve Torah. That's another discussion altogether. But any thoughts on that? I mean, and when I say that, I don't think we actually discussed Judah going into exile, but we did discuss that all the brothers came into exile in Egypt.
Yeah, well, Judah puts himself in exile after he sells Joseph. He puts himself into exile, which is the story of Tamar.
And he goes and lives amongst the Canaanites, right? Mm-hmm.
Yep, and now he's returned, right? So something has happened that he's returned. And I would say that's probably because of him taking responsibility and for Tamar. Right. And now he's showing further responsibility. But yeah, I don't see, oh goodness gracious, substitutionary atonement or whatever here. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say, one of the reasons why Israel turns down Reuben is because Reuben's not making it personal to him. He's offering his sons. Okay. And I understand that but his sons are the younger, right? And up and coming of the family lineage. Why would he cut off the family lineage at that point? Why is he sacrificing his sons versus sacrificing himself, where Judah is putting himself in that position?
Right.
Yeah, but again, we got a problem, right? Like Reuben is showing, you're right, Deb. Like Reuben is showing he still doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Right.
Judah is not sacrificing himself in that sense.
No, but he's taking the responsibility of it.
Yes, he's taking the responsibility. Yes, and that's what I'm saying. So that's why I'm saying, like, I don't see this substitutionary atonement. I don't see this to death thing going on here, right?
But I do see that the blaming, though, would be that, you can blame me. You can put that burden upon me. If your son doesn't return, that burden is upon me. And so I can see where Rabbi is coming from in that fact, because it's taking,
well, maybe, right? Because if we're going to link it all the way to what Yeshua did on the cross, if there's not substitutionary atonement here, is there substitutionary atonement there?
Sure.
Right? Or was the work on the cross something different? And again, we're in a Christian concealment.
And I can tell you, this is important. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Doesn't have anything to do with Yeshua's death.
Right. Yeah.
It has to do with his rights that are in Philippians. And this is important because in Philippians, there's an indication that Paul is trying to attain to something. So he goes through Philippians 2 and talks about how Yeshua did not find it robbery to be equal with God.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So neither should you. Right. That's kind of what Paul's saying there. But then he says, I'm trying to attain to the resurrection. Haven't found it yet. Haven't gotten to it yet. Right. And then what does it say? It says, if the spirit of him who dwells within you, if the spirit of him who raised Christ from the dead dwells within you, he will give life to your mortal bodies. In other words, the resurrection was more important than the death. But here's the part that's significant, is Judah was surrendering something very important. And that is, Reuben had gone into a state of what what, Yehoshua, would you say that part of the discussion we had this last week concerning Reuben was almost an ego state
Oh, for
of,
sure.
of
I mean,
trying to be the firstborn?
yes,
Um,
100%. Yeah.
and that was the concept of trying to move the couch and position and
Move,
basically
move, yeah,
almost,
move the couch, save
yeah.
Joseph,
Mhm.
do something here, but he
Yeah, kill my
never,
kids,
right,
right?
but he never does it. Like
He
he
never
doesn't,
steps up.
right, he
Mhm.
doesn't step into, Deborah, what you rightly named, um, the responsibility, the act, like stepping beyond, the desire for the sake of himself and into the desire for the sake of others. Right.
So let me make something clear. Number one, first of all, let me just say this. I love that we can actually have this Midrash. This is exactly how Midrash is supposed to go. Being a rabbi does not make me the end all. And believe you me, sometimes I use concealments because people aren't ready for a certain thing, right?
Oh, hallelujah. Did I lose y'all? Did everybody go away?
Give us a
I'm
second.
still here.
Oh, there you go.
So we have a very, very complex business phone, and we really don't know how to operate it. And so
Oh, yeah.
it does what it wants to do. So that was an interruption. But anyways, okay. So a couple things. Number one is like I said, I think it's important that people understand how Midrash really works. Being a rabbi does not make me the end all and me say, oh, this is how it is. The corporate collective consciousness creates the system of truth, okay, based upon the presence of absolute truth, which is Torah. So again, this is kind of like co-authorship in that we take Torah, which is the breath of God, the will of God, the voice of God, the inner voice or the Bak Kol, and we connect with it through our framing, right? And then we understand how that framing then becomes important to our lifestyle choices, to our purpose, etc. So let me make clear that when Yehoshua says, hey, this is bristling against me, great. That's exactly what we want, because then we get the perspectives, right? That's the beauty of Midrash. But now watch this. Never did I indicate that Judah was stepping up to do a substitutionary sacrifice. I never actually got to finish that part. But what I did say is that's what Christianity believes, is that Yeshua was a substitutionary sacrifice. But what it actually is saying in Romans is, who would do this for another person? If someone was valuable enough in their righteousness, someone would rarely, if they were estranged from them, die for them. What about even a good person? And yet, while we are enemies of God, he does it. In other words, we're the worst of the worst, and he does it. Now, let me propose to you that that's a very, very important verse that gets inappropriately used to offer the misunderstood doctrine of Augustinianism. But I want to make sure that we understand that the word sacrifice is very inappropriate. And there's not really an indication that that's actually the part that's important here. when Paul is making this statement in Romans, it is not about whether he was a substitutionary sacrifice or not, but instead about who he would do it for. And that's the part where I say Messiah was being trained epigenetically through Judah. Judah steps up and says, I will cover this. I will make sure that this is taken care of. But I also will offer that if he's not okay, that I have surrendered my right to firstborn. Because Simeon and Levi were disqualified. We know that they became loathsome in the eyes of Jacob. Furthermore, we know Simeon was basically the one who wanted to kill Joseph. Furthermore, we know that although Levi is not mentioned in this system, he's one of the 11, right? And maybe we go to he's one of the 10 because we don't necessarily count Benjamin in this. He probably wasn't even present with his brothers. But what we do is we definitely say, this is where Reuben fails. This definitely sets him as not qualified as the firstborn. This is where Simeon and Levi fail. This is where they're not qualified as the firstborn. Judah operates as the firstborn in a very mystical manner. I don't think Judah was vying for the throne. I don't think Judah was going, oh, if I do this, I'll be the firstborn. Whatever exile he went into, and I agree with Yehoshua on this, they definitely, or Torah definitely indicates that he left the family and was living in the land of Canaan separate from his family. It's an intermission to what happens with Joseph, right? But then we have this context or this concept where all of a sudden there's a change that occurs. And that change that occurs, definitely, I agree, humility plays a role here, right? Humble yourself before God and he will raise you up to a position of honor, right? There is.
I just had another thought too that hit me and everything. It's like Judah's still not the firstborn.
Right.
Right? Like Joseph or Ephraim is.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
yeah, according to Jacob, right?
Right. So I don't know what I'm trying to get at. I feel like I'm close to something here, but it's like Jesus, Yeshua is not the firstborn, Adam is.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that second son is the king.
Yeah, baby. And that is important, right? The disqualifications occur. Why? What is the biggest thing that happened with Simeon and Levi? They murdered covenant people. They murdered Abrahamic covenant people because they had gotten circumcised, right? What happens with Reuben and his ego and all that and him not showing up, love that. That is actually so much better than the sentiment about what people think happened with Reuben. But Judah does something interesting. And this is powerful because Judah's the one who ends up with the Messiah's bloodline. And I'm not entirely sure that was determined at his birth.
Yeah.
I propose to you that this is another adjustment.
Yeah, rabbis would argue that it isn't. I mean, they basically say that Joseph's blood, but that doesn't make sense. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So am I understanding this right? It's kind of like the determination of the birthright for future kings. I mean, is that what this is all leading to at this point?
Sure.
This is kind of what I'm seeing forming in my mind as we're going through this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Because Judah's son David is definitely the extreme of this, right? We can see where David does this same type of thing, accepts exile, humbles himself through it, becomes king. I mean, it's all there, right? Judah is playing out what David is going to do. David is playing out what Yeshua is going to do. But what's really powerful about this is the concept of table fellowship. You see, what people don't realize is that sacrifice is contained in a very inappropriate thought, that you have to give something up that's valuable to you. That is not how this works. Table fellowship was the ability to sit at the table in shalom with the clan leader, and better yet, with your father. And so the offer of table fellowship, the offer of eating with the clan leader or eating with the father, had to do with the mechanism of being in peace with him. That's why it's so powerful. When the prodigal son returns, he tells him, kill the fatted calf, create the table fellowship, sit him down and eat with me as my equal. Paul says it was not robbery that Yeshua sat at that table. It was not something that he was to be grasped, is really what it says. In other words, Yeshua did not have to reach out and take it, or he did not have to attain to it, but already had it, right? And that we are supposed to think the same way.
Yeah.
So the powerful element here is that there is no substitutionary sacrifice, because that's not how it works. The blood of bulls and goats never offers a remission of sin. Judah tells his father, if I am not able to deliver on my words, I have sinned against you all of my days. I will never sit at your table again. And so not only does he offer pure exile, which is death. Why? How do we know that? Because Jacob has concluded that Joseph is torn by the animals.
Well, being away from the tent, and once again, I'm putting that in air quotes, you can't see it, but away from the tent would be death, would be, nakedness and shame and death,
Right.
because we have that understanding. So I can see where you're coming from in that fact that, him removing himself from his father's tent would equal death.
I have something there too.
Okay.
We hear this a lot in like Hollywood and everything, but there are far worse things than death.
Oh yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
like I think we actually should not equate exile and nakedness and shame to death. Because I think exile, shame, and nakedness are actually worse than death. Right? Because death is what? Well, Sheol, we don't know. Right? Reset, maybe. Next life. Whatever that is. So it's weird and everything to say this and everything, but I think equating death to a judgment, yes. To punishment, no. Because then we get back into hell. If death is a punishment, then we're back into hell.
I'm using death as, in the Hebrew sense, as an empty belly. Right? So in Hebrew understanding, if you're dead, it's because you have an empty belly.
Right.
Right? An empty belly equated to death.
I think one of the things that we can do is kind of determine what is the realm of death versus the realm of life, right? So what do we understand? First and foremost, let me make this clear. I am not talking about the expiration of the body, nor what happens afterwards, but instead the Hebrew understanding of the idiomatic statement of death. A Hebrew who has a full belly is considered to be in life. And the concept goes into a bunch of things like abundant crops, whatever, right? Famine is a version of death. The premise is that in that context, then now the realm of life would be a full belly, the realm of death would be an empty belly. And we're not necessarily talking about the expiration of body or the reset as you've called it, or the next life, but instead the concept of being without, right? So a couple things I want to touch on, and I think this is important. I think what we're probably going to end up doing is tying this into the rabbi's nugget. And once I get my head wrapped around how we're going to do that, we can proceed forward. So first of all, I think what is significant, and I think this is the important part, is that Judah begins to step into Messiah garments, as it were, Messiah state of thinking, Messiah state of being, that will eventually lead to Yeshua. And I think another element is that the more that he's in this state of humility and responsibility and whatever, we're going to see this mechanism of that occurring. Okay. I actually personally dislike the word responsibility because it doesn't actually communicate correctly what it is.
Yeah.
And I think you and I have talked about this before, that there's a better way to describe responsibility. But the system of saying, I will make this my mission, I will make this my purpose, that is powerful, right? Judah's mind appears to be changing, and it eventually definitely will result in the Messiah's bloodline. Now, I don't know that it's determined here in Egypt or whether it was determined at the time of Tamar. But what I do know is that he has a very different way of operating right now. You can't go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to even say it, but was it when he saved Joseph's life by selling him? Like he did take action. Would we call it sin? Possibly. Will we call it sin next week? I don't know.
Right.
But
and I think that
action.
Right. And that goes back to my question about prison, right? Where Joseph puts his brothers in prison. So one of the things I want to say is that Joseph only holds his brothers responsible to the point that they sell him, right? Because I think it's in the Chumash, I don't know for sure, but I think it was I can't remember who the commentary was, but I can tell you it might have been Rabbi Hirsch's Pentateuch, where basically it says that Joseph was in the cistern for 3 days and 3 nights, and that is why he put his brothers in for that amount of time. Now we know they're under lock and key; they're not in the cistern. We already figured that out in the Hebrew, right? But what's important is that what Joseph is saying is Potiphar made his own decision. Potiphar's wife made her own decision. Y'all didn't make those decisions.
Yeah, we talked about it this morning in terms of like the Sephiroth. It was kind of cool, but one of the guys said, I don't know if I could have done that. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, I think I would have just killed them. And I was like, okay, great. So, what do you think that means and everything? Like without shame, without guilt, without anything, what do you think that means? And he was like, oh, I'm desiring for myself. And I'm like, yeah, yourself only. So what do you think it means that Joseph did this? And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, okay, well, think about it like this. What you just did was like, harsh givarah, right? He's like, yeah. So I was like, what's the opposite of that? What's the, unrestricted chesed to the unrestricted givarah? And he was like, oh, he would have just forgiven them immediately, right? And I was like, okay, if he forgives them immediately, what happens? And took him a little bit, and then he was like, well, we don't know because like there's too many variables. Like were the boys did they actually repent? Would Simeon have killed Joseph and got with Levi and killed everybody in Joseph's house? Would there's so many things and everything, right? And I was like, okay, so now if we were like in the Tiferet, what would he do? And he was like, he would test them. And I was like, and what do we see him do? And he's like, he tests them, right? And then we see Simeon get, arrested first. They go back, they come back. He puts them in for 3 days. He puts the listener with them, all of that. And so, yeah, we really got into that today. But in terms of like the Sephiroth and having spiritual discernment and then, asking for that ourselves.
Yep. It's pretty much kind of the same direction we went today as well. In the context of the idea that it was probably a tikkun. It was probably that there was something worse appointed for them.
Yes.
When he
100%.
put them, and when he put them in house arrest versus a cistern, he canceled that.
Yep.
And what's interesting about that is it's two very important things. Number one is what is our vindictive self or the Gevurah unbridled actually present, right? Absolute extreme vengeance. I will kill him, right? I would, it's like the woman who stands up and says, I hope these bad things happen to you when you go to prison, right? During sentencing, instead of the person who stood up and said, you know what? Whatever you had going on at that moment, you were doing the best you could do with what you had to work with. And so I release you from responsibility as an avenger of blood and Kabbalistically allow my debt to be sold to another creditor. And that creditor, of course, is Yeshua, right? But the premise here, and this is powerful, is yes, that Joseph offered some sort of tikkun. I want to take a break, and I want to come back. And when we come back, I'm thinking it's going to be probably about 30 to 40 minutes. And when we come back, we're going to get into the rabbi's nugget and tie all this together. All right. For those of you who are not going to be able to be here, I want to say Shabbat Shalom. For the rest of you, I will see you in a bit. Shabbat Shalom.